So, is it working? JavaScript. How did you guys feel after this weekend?
So amazing.
Really? Tell me more.
I got a haircut.
I saw. It looks great. Anyways, so this lecture is going to be about JavaScript. It's supposedly your intro to JavaScript lecture. I think of it more as here are all the complexities of JavaScript that are going to mess you up. So like one thing I like that Prince always says in his lectures, he's always like, notice, you're going to mess this up. You will mess this up. So this whole lecture is going to be just that. I think of it more of like a transition from Ruby into JavaScript, how things are really different and what you should be paying attention to. So I'm not like telling you to pay attention to every single thing because there's no way that you're going to remember every single thing, but it's just a way for you to like get exposure to how JavaScript works so that you can start thinking in JavaScript. And then when you do mess up some of the things that we covered today, which you will, I've learned them multiple times and I've still messed them up, at least you'll remember like, oh, okay, it works like this and that's why, and I remember Jane mentioning it. So that's kind of what it's about. We're going to briefly talk about the history of JavaScript, not that interesting, how it fits into the request-response cycle, a very small exposure to the DOM just because you guys are going to be working with the DOM a lot. So it's important to like sprinkle it in sometimes. It might make zero sense to you today, but you just like absorb it a little bit so that when you get more exposure to it later, you won't be completely lost. And then we'll go over like the data types in JavaScript, some of the complexities with like scoping and hoisting, let, const, var, how things are different, a little bit about functions. So, you guys did 35 labs this weekend. Who did them? All right, cool. So you've had some exposure to JavaScript. What did you think was different about JavaScript or kind of like really weird? Shout them out, Ruby.
I need to like declare the variable with the word like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like declaration keywords. What else?
There's just a lot more syntax.
Mm-hmm. In what way?
Like the semicolons.
Semicolons? What else? Curly mustaches?
Yeah, the curly braces, the parentheses.
Parens. Yeah. Like in Ruby, when you use functions, you don't have to invoke them, but in JavaScript you do. Things like that. What else? What about like being more explicit in JavaScript? Does anyone know what I mean by that? Do you have to use the return keywords in JavaScript?
Oh yeah.
Yes. So you have to use the return keywords. You have to be explicit about what you want. Anything else? All right, I'm gonna throw this in here. Hoisting. Let's see, I have a lot of notes about this, guys. Nothing else that tripped you up? Cat?
The way it just kind of like will assume data types for certain things.
Yes, coercion. What about functions? What's different about functions?
Having to use the parentheses to invoke the function.
Yes, having to use parentheses. What about like passing functions into functions as parameters?
Cool.
Yeah, you can do stuff like that. So these are all things we're basically gonna talk about today. A little bit about the history of JavaScript in like 30 seconds. Basically, in the land of the internet, when we had Netscape, Mark Anderson dreamed of a more dynamic web. He was like the co-founder of Netscape. The way I learned it was when the internet was first created, it was a way for researchers to share their research. So it was all static web pages, but now people were having ideas of like how to make the internet more interactive. So Brandon and I came up with JavaScript in 10 days. So you got to be a little bit forgiving when it comes to JavaScript because it was only created in 10 days. And at first it wasn't a very respected language, but as newer additions came out and improvements were made every year, it became more powerful, more respected, and then when you got to things like Google Maps, people got to really see how useful it is. Because suddenly you can interact with maps. You couldn't do that back when you had MapQuest and stuff. So JavaScript is here to stay. It's also one of the only languages that can run in the browser. And it would be very, very hard to come up with a brand new language that's cross-compatible across multiple browsers and be able to use that. So JavaScript is here. And there are some standards of JavaScript, every year new things are released. We call that ECMAScript. You might have heard things like ECMAScript 2015 or ES5 versus ES6. Right now, a lot of developers use ES6 and they're starting to use ES7 features and things like that. But unfortunately, not all browsers are up to date. So, and this is just stuff for your information, not something you have to worry about every single day, but it's important to be familiar. Oh, I have this up already. You can look at things like what's compatible in different browsers, so you get an idea. So for instance, these are JavaScript features. Some of them are super new, some are older, and you can see which browsers support what. So for instance, Internet Explorer is dying out, right? It doesn't really support that much stuff. But then you have things like Chrome, and it's all in the green, and it supports a lot more stuff. So just something to be familiar with. And one way that we get around this problem too is transpiling. So developers want to write things in, with the newest features, they want to use ES6, ES7, but not every browser can handle it. So something that your application can do in the background is transpile the code that you've written with the latest features into an older version of JavaScript. And it's not something you'll really have to do yourself, but when you write applications with JavaScript and with React, you'll have files there, like a Babel.rc file or something that'll take care of that kind of stuff for you. Just like when you create a Rails new app, there's a lot of files there and you don't touch a lot of them. You don't know what a lot of them will do. So this is not something you have to work with all the time, but it's important to be aware of. So this is Babel. Oh, I don't like this page of it. Let me look up a different version.
Jane, are you recording?
I am. I like this. So, for instance, if you write something in the newest JavaScript, you can see how it gets turned into an older version. So, we don't use var as much anymore, and we like to use things like arrow functions. So this is how your code gets transpiled into an older version. Any questions about that? All right, so let's move on to the request response cycle. As you guys remember, one request gets one response. This is still the case when we use JavaScript, but there's also some things that are different that go on. So for example, I have pulled up here a Rails application. You guys see this form, right? Does this look familiar or have you forgotten Rails completely? I will be honest, once we switched into JavaScript, I'm done. I don't remember Rails anymore. How does this look in the browser? Can you write ERB in the browser? So what happens to this? How does this look like on the front end?
It gets changed to HTML.
Exactly. So somewhere in our application, it gets compiled down to HTML. So if I open this, which I already have a server running for that. I came prepared, guys. I came prepared. If I open this form, that's not what I want. and we look at it, you can see that it's all HTML. There's no JavaScript going on here. Or there's no like ERB. You can't use ERB in the browser. So that's kind of what makes JavaScript so special. So if we make a request to like github.com. Oh no, now I have to sign in. Oh no. Sorry guys. All right, so we're signed in. If you go on your network tab and you're like making a request to this site, you should see a bunch of things pop up here. There's a way to see all of them. I thought this was how you see all of them. But usually there's like a lot of different requests coming in. Some are images, some are JSON, and some of that stuff, oh yeah, there it is, under all. So there's a lot of other things going on in the background, and some of them are going to be JavaScript, which implies that JavaScript can be run in the browser. So, my favorite trick. I think you could do this. I can run some code and change stuff.
You can plus to make it a bit bigger.
I will plus all you want. So what have I just done? I've altered this page. I can actually edit any of this stuff now. Oops, I got rid of a button. Oh well. But like, you can do stuff like this with JavaScript. So it's pretty cool. The only problem is once I refresh, those changes are just gone. But how do we get the JavaScript code that we write to actually travel with us to those web pages instead of just like change stuff in the browser? How do we include JavaScript in our applications? Andy?
Probably in the HTML.
All right, let's try it out. So does anyone know like the shortcut to make a basic template of an HTML? HTML tab? Nice. All right, so let's give it a heading. What should we call it?
James lecture.
James JS lecture. Very cool. Let's see if it's working. Don't worry about that stuff. All right. Now, if I want to include some JavaScript in here, what do I need to do? Okay, where should I put the script tag? There's multiple places where you can put a script tag. Let's first try it over here. So what goes in my script file?
Source.
So some of this stuff, some of it is useful, right? Maybe type to tell us that it's JavaScript. Source is if you have a file, which we're going to get to. I can also put some JavaScript in here. So if I wanted to console log something on this page, which you're going to do a lot of console logging, and then trying to see it on the browser, you can do something like this. So I've refreshed, and look, now there's JavaScript on my page. And I didn't have to like go in the browser and put it there. It came with my HTML. What would I do if I wanted to link a file? So I don't want to, every single time, write big portions of JavaScript between script tags. I want to connect a file and be able to put this console log here and console log some bananas. You know, you have to make it different, right, to make sure that it works. How would I do that? Gavin?
Would you just write the file name .js?
Okay. So which one?
Next.
Index.js?
Yeah, .js.
Anything else? Will this work? It worked! I always thought you had to do this. But it works. Very cool. So there's a few problems with doing it this way. Does anyone know what they are? Gavin?
You might have a few files with the same name.
No, we're not going to do that. That's not good practice. Andy?
Are you talking about like having the script on the top?
Mm-hmm.
So like if you have like a bunch of images and text that you want to load from like CSS, it's like a bad idea to put script on the top because like JavaScript takes the longest to load. So you want to put every JavaScript on the bottom so that like all the images and everything else from CSS can load.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So this file is read top to bottom. If I had a lot of stuff going on in my JavaScript file, like not just a console log, but like I was making requests to a database and like I was trying to load a lot of stuff, the file would be read top to bottom and this would hang up everything else from loading. And it's not a very good user experience. Like usually users will go on your site for like 2 seconds. If it doesn't load, they're gonna leave your site. So you don't wanna do that. Is there another reason why this could be problematic? What is the point of JavaScript? Why do we use it? We want to like change different elements in our browser. If you have all the elements down here and you're trying to run your JavaScript up here and you're relying on certain elements and they haven't loaded yet, you're going to run into problems. So for example, say we do want to select this element. And this is where like a little bit of DOM manipulation is going to come in. It's not going to be like a major part of this lecture. But like say I want to select this H1 element. How would I do that? Does anyone know? Okay, I like where you're going with this. Then? So it worked. So we've selected this element, right? This is like gonna be your main use of JavaScript. You're selecting elements and you're doing stuff with them. So if I wanted to do something on the page, you can do something like take this element and change its inner HTML. See, it's already popping up what its inner HTML is. Say you want to change it to something else. That's like the main use of JavaScript. You like change it right on your page. But if we wanted to access this H1 in our file and do like and we try to console log this H1, is this going to work? It's console logging null. Why?
Right. Because you're defining the H1 as JS lecture after your...
Exactly. So if we're depending on certain elements, it doesn't make sense to do it this way. There's a few ways around this. One, I've sometimes seen the word defer, which basically keeps your JavaScript like to run last and like waits for everything. So now, if we do this, it console logs our element. I've also experienced like moving this to the bottom, still keeping it in your body, but having it appear below everything else. And it still loads. And another thing that you're going to be running into a lot, so I want to make sure I expose this to you guys now, is you're going to use event listeners sometimes. Does anyone know what an event listener is? No one knows what an event is? Cat? That's okay. I mean, I'm just curious.
It's used for like action
Exactly. So like it's a way to make your web page more dynamic. Someone clicks on something, there's an event listener in the background created using JavaScript where it's listening for that click event, and then something happens when that click event occurs. So a common event listener that you guys will often be using is called DOM content loaded. So you're waiting for everything to make sure that it's loaded, all the HTML is loaded, your DOM is loaded before you do anything else. So if I wanted to write an event listener like that, I would use add event listener. Does anyone know the arguments that add event listener takes? Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's gonna be our first one that gets a string.
Nice.
9. The second one is usually like an initialize function.
So then we give this a function. So with add event listener, the first argument of this add event listener function is always the event that you're listening for. So it could be like click, on mouse hover, something like that, on DOM content loaded in our case. And the second argument is going to be a set of instructions of like, what do you want to occur when this happens? And how do we define a set of instructions? You write a function, exactly. Is everyone familiar with this syntax of writing functions in JavaScript? The new arrow notation? That's something we're going to have to go over. Okay, so in JavaScript, how would you write a function? You use the word function, right? And then what? Mm-hmm. Exactly, and then you tell it what to do. In ES6, you can use arrow notation, and it's the same exact thing as doing it like this, and you just leave out the function keyword. It's the same thing. It's very useful, but it can get it can take getting used to before you feel comfortable with it. We can do it the old way. It's fine. Oh no. Why all caps? So this is something you'll see fairly frequently. You're waiting for everything on your page to load before you try to do stuff. So when you're writing anything to do with DOM manipulation, you might wrap all your code in like a giant content loaded. So it's important for you to get some exposure to it now. Any questions about that part of it?
If
Matt.
we put a console log outside of that event listener, will it land before the hello world? Yeah, like on line 4. Will it land before or after?
Does anyone have any guesses? Gavin?
After.
Let's find out. So just to reiterate before we reload the page, let's look at the code for a second. So we're adding an event listener and saying, once the DOM content loads, run this function. In addition to adding an event listener, a separate thing is we're logging hi there.
Mm-hmm. So does anyone have any guesses? Ruby?
I think it's gonna say hi there first.
I think so too, but you never truly know with JavaScript,
Let's see.
and you never truly know how fast something can load. So it's possible that it'll be loaded before. Actually, now that I think about it, I don't know. Let's find out. Let's find out. Yeah, so it has hi there first. But things can be asynchronous, and you sometimes can't even predict what's going to happen first and like how fast something loads.
Why does it have hi there first?
So it has hi there first because this part waits for everything to load, which is like a longer operation. So it prints this, and then when this event occurred and everything loaded, it prints this.
So then is hi there part of the DOM content?
Technically, kind
Well,
of.
yeah.
Right.
Well, the DOM content is technically stuff that's already on the page. So like this is DOM content. Hi there is just a console log that we're printing.
But if we also would look at our index.html file, this script is referenced as part of the DOM. It isn't like a DOM element, but it is one of the things that has to be loaded. And before the DOM can fully load, this script file will be run.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, that will 99.9% of the time, that entire file will get run before the DOM is fully loaded.
All right, let's go on to the different data types in JavaScript. There's 7 different data types in JavaScript. Who can tell me what they are? Boolean, my favorite. Gavin.
Null.
Null. All right. Number. All right. Shout them out. Object. Oh, yo. We don't want that. Okay. 2 more. Symbol. Undefined. All right. Cool. Symbols, I haven't really experienced using them very much in JavaScript. It's not like Ruby symbols, where you have your hash and like your keys are technically symbols. You don't really do that in JavaScript. So like in JavaScript, when you have an object, like if you have Jane, me, this is technically a string. So you're probably never gonna use symbols. I haven't had to use them yet. If you run into using symbols, please do let me know. What about the difference between null and undefined? Does anyone know the difference?
So null is like just like absence of like every like. So okay, so undefined is like it's been declared but hasn't been assigned yet. But null is just like the absence of like it's just nothing.
Yes, that is true. How does something get to be null though? Does anyone know? So the difference between null and undefined is with null, it means a human put it there. Someone specifically wrote in the code, I want this thing to be null. Don't mess with it. Usually you can start off with something being null and then assign it later. With undefined, it usually means you forgot to define something. So like, you're using a variable and you mistyped it, or you actually forgot to define that variable, or you're using a function and functions have to return something. If you try to use a function and you invoke it and you try to save it into a variable and you never use the return in that function, then it's going to be undefined. Okay, cool. What kind of things are objects in JavaScript? Did you just say everything? Could you elaborate?
No, I can't.
Ruby.
Well, I wasn't gonna give such a big answer. I was just gonna say like hashes and arrays.
There's no such thing as a hash in
Like, what a
JavaScript.
hash is to us and an array.
So an array is an object? Really? Let's see. How do you determine the data type of something in JavaScript? Type of. All right. An array is an object. What else is an object in JavaScript?
Literal.
So literal objects. We call them pohos or pojos, plain old JavaScript objects. What else, Kat?
Functions.
Functions are objects. Functions are very interesting in JavaScript because if you do type of on a function, it will tell you function, but it actually is an object. Anything else? There's some good ones. This one is my favorite. Null is an object in JavaScript. I can't fully 100% explain why. Maybe someone can write a blog post about this. So I know it has something to do with like JavaScript being created in 10 days and like something's not transferring over correctly because your computer runs in like zeros and ones underneath the hood. So something didn't translate over correctly, that objects are type of, or null is type of object. And if we try to change this part of JavaScript now, the whole internet will break.
You're saying this is a mistake?
I don't think it's a mistake. I think it's actually the way like things were transferred over from zeros and ones.
Can we get null methods?
You can write your blog post about this if you want. There's also something called promises, which we're not going to get into today, but it has to do with the asynchronous nature of JavaScript. Like you're trying to do some big task, like go into a database, you use a promise to do that, and it allows JavaScript to go off, do that task, and continue running through your code. That's called a promise. A promise is technically an object. So we can put that here. null. There's also something called array-like objects. I love JavaScript, guys. So, I'm gonna do something that's bad practice. Don't do this. I'm gonna give my thing two H1s. What do I do if I want to select both of these elements in my DOM? How do I select both of them at the same time? Okay, we can do that. We can also use other stuff like get elements by tag name. What do you think this will return? Like, the point of doing this kind of stuff when you use JavaScript is you select a bunch of elements at once and then you do something to all of them. So what do you think this should return? Hugo?
All the H1 tags.
In what kind of collection?
Maybe an array like object.
Yes! Yes, Ruby, that is exactly where I'm going. Yes, Hugo, it should return an array. It returns, well, it doesn't return anything, but if we look at H1s, it returns this thing called node list, which kind of looks like an array. Once you get more comfortable with JavaScript, you'll see stuff like this. You'll see that it defines what each element is, so it looks kind of like an array. How do we check if this is truly an array? Remember that in JavaScript, you can't do type of on an array because it returns object. So how do we check if something is truly an array? But I think you can do .length on other things too, like technically on functions, you can do .length and it returns the number of parameters. So I don't think that way will work, but that's a really good idea. Danny? Well, type of returns an object for arrays, so that doesn't help us. There is a way. There is always a way. So you can do array.isArray. So I kind of think of this like classes. There's this like giant array class, and like things that are arrays inherit from that class. So here we're like using this giant array class, and we're calling isArray on it, and you call it on the thing, or you pass it the thing that you want to check if it's an array. And it's telling you this is actually not an array, guys, because this is an array-like object. And you will mess this up, I promise. I have helped multiple mods 3 students before who have messed this up. They're like, I'm going to grab this whole collection. I'm going to do for each on it. I'm going to do some array method on it to like change something about it. And then it doesn't work because it's actually an array-like object. So when you experience this, you can force it into an array. Does anyone know how? This is just a side note for going into the future. You can do array from. So it turns something into an array from whatever you pass it. So if you pass it this, it turns it into a true array. So now, if I say, is this thing an array? It's going to say true. So there is this idea of array-like objects in JavaScript. So keep that in mind. Yes, Hugo?
So you can't iterate over array-like objects?
You can sometimes iterate over array-like objects. That's another thing about JavaScript. So there's this idea of proto, which is like where your thing inherits stuff from. So if something is an array, where is a thing that's an array? This thing is an array. It's going to mention all of the array methods here. Like, you can use .filter on it because it's an array. You can use for each. You can use join. You can use push, map, pop. Some of these are familiar. So if you have something that comes out being a node list, or sometimes you'll have something that comes out and it says HTML collection, like if you did get elements by tag name here, it would be an HTML collection. If you press this proto, it'll tell you the different methods you can do on it. So with query selector all, it looks like you can do a for each on it. If you were to use get elements by tag name and give it h1, I know for a fact that one you cannot do for each on. So if you're ever in doubt, you can click on proto to see the type of methods that you can run on something. Just as a side note to make your life easier going into the future. All right, let's talk about what things are falsy in JavaScript. There's 6 of them, so there's your hint. What things are falsy?
0.
Nice. I love that about JavaScript. It's not the case in Ruby. So going from one language to the other, you can sometimes get confused. It's really cool that 0 is false in JavaScript. What else? Gavin?
False.
Nice. What else? Shout them out. Someone other than Gavin should know. All right, Gavin, give me another one.
Nan,
What is nan?
not a number.
Okay. And what data type is not a number? It's a number. I love JavaScript, guys. It's so beautiful. What else? We got 3 of them. That means we only got half of them.
Empty string.
No, yeah. So look up here. Like, some of these are obvious. What else? There's another one up here that we talked about. Undefined. There's one more. How do we find out if something is falsy? Like, how do I find out if this empty string is a falsy value in JavaScript or not?
Double bang.
Yeah, you do the bang bang. There you go. So you can do this when you're in doubt, and then it'll help you. Like, one thing I often do is I write if statements and I give it something that I assume is like truthy versus falsy. And then I do one thing if it's falsy and truthy if it's something else. So if you're ever in doubt, you can do the bang bang. Is an empty array falsy in JavaScript? How do you find out if an array is actually empty in JavaScript? How do you do it in Ruby? JavaScript doesn't do that. What can you do in JavaScript? Think outside the box. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can check if the dot length of an array is truthy or falsy. Because if it's 0, it's going to be falsy. So that's a super useful thing you can do. What about type coercion? Have you guys heard about type coercion when it comes to JavaScript?
Like when it is trying to combine things that are not the same type and it changes the type of thing.
Mm-hmm. All right, what are some examples? Like, what can I type in here that'll coerce something into something else? Hugo?
1 plus string plus.
Yeah. So I'll give it a string. What do you think this will return? I'll make it bigger. Is this too small? What do you think this will return?
Is it a cube?
It's a queue. It's a string.
It's just like overlapping that planet.
Yeah, it's overlapping that planet. Okay, what about this? What is this going to return? Very nice. What about this? Any guesses? Is this gonna be a number?
No.
So it's gonna be
Not
not a number. This is great, guys. Just be really careful with type coercion. JavaScript is trying to be clever and useful. It's like, oh, I see you're concatenating something, a string with not a string, so I'm just gonna turn the whole thing into a string for you. So it's gonna try to make up the gaps for you not telling it what you want, but you could get into trouble. and there might be silent errors going on, and you might not realize that some coercion is going on under the hood. So just be really careful how you use this. That gets into the point of when to use double equals versus triple equals. We never use double equals, but it's important to understand what double equals does if we were to use double equals.
So it's like a loose comparison.
Mhm.
So if you have 7 and a string of 7, you would say it's the same.
All right, let's try it. So you have 7 double equal to a string of 7. You're saying what is it going to return? Very nice. So it basically checks, like, are these two things equal if I try to coerce something into a similar type? So that's why this returns true. It doesn't take the data type into consideration. So for instance, like 1 and true, because true can be coerced into a 1, this would return true. And then with double equals or triple equals, what would this return? False. So make sure that you use triple equals because it takes the data type into consideration too. You will mess this up. You will mess this up because you're coming from Ruby where you use the double equals and one day you're going to forget. You're also going to forget your returns sometimes. It happens. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about, we talked about coercion. Does anyone know what these ambiguous letters are? Speak up, please. So this stands for pass by value and pass by reference. Does anyone have any idea what that even means? Jordan knows. Jordan has a vague idea. I can smell it. Tell me about your vague idea.
Well, it's not from the lab, it's from a course I took 6 years ago.
That's fine.
So one is pass by references. You're not actually passing the value, you're passing like something that points to that value.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
when you reassign that, you're not changing the value.
Exactly. We're going to go over this in a second. Another wonderful blog post topic. Every single one of these things, you can look back at these notes and pluck any one of them and write a blog post about it. Any one of these. Array-like objects. Null type of being object. Coercion. Pass by value, pass by reference. So feel free to use these as blog post topics. So in JavaScript, we have this idea of primitive data types and complex data types. What are primitive data types? Andy?
Everything not object.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. I think of it more like numbers and strings are primitives. You don't care too much about null and undefined. We don't really use symbols. What about complex data types? So complex data types are basically arrays and objects. So something special about primitive data types in JavaScript is that they cannot be mutated. You can reassign a string, but you cannot mutate a string. So if I have a string, and I'm even going to use let to prove my point here. If you have a string in JavaScript, and you set it equal to, what should our string be? We're going to make our string Andy. Hi, Andy. So let's just confirm. String is Andy. If I wanted to do something, like change the 0th index of Andy to something else, like the letter X, it didn't tell me that it didn't work. It looks like maybe it worked. But if you look at string, it refuses to let you change it, which is something I discovered by accident because in Ruby, that's not the case. So if you do IRB and you do string equals Andy, and then you try to reassign it, it will let you do this. So in JavaScript, primitive data types can be reassigned, but you can't mutate like a single piece of it. But with objects and arrays, you can. So like you can totally take an index 0 of an array and change it to something else. And that works. But this is the idea of pass by value versus pass by reference. So primitive data types are basically passed by value. You always remember what value they are. But with complex data types, it's not the case. And we'll get into that. So what is this going to return? These are two things that look the same, right? So who said true? Who says true? Raise your hands. Raise them higher. Be assertive.
Saying this for a reason, it's not going to be wrong.
That's okay.
They both look like arrays to me.
Yes. It is false.
Yours.
Yes. So, yes, we're going to get into this. So I have an array. I set it equal to an empty array. If you want, I'll prove my point. I'll set it equal to an array with stuff in it. I have array 2. I set it equal to an array with the same stuff in it. I've declared these two variables. So I've declared them as separate variables. And now they're like stored as separate things. And they don't point to the same reference. JavaScript is again trying to be smart. It knows that complex data types like objects and arrays can take up a lot of space. So if it notices that you're using the same object, it wants to point you to the same location. Here it thinks you're using two separate arrays, two separate objects, because you've declared them as two separate things. If you were to do array 3 and set it equal to array, now you're actually telling JavaScript that these two point to the same reference. So now, if you check if array 2 is equal to array, what is it going to be? It's going to be true. So I guess the shortcut way of remembering this is that if you set two things equal to each other with like an equal sign, you assign that you mean that they're the same thing and that they're stored in the same place. But if you declare them as two separate things, they will be false. So that's why this is equal to false.
What if you push on one of those arrays?
That's what we're doing next.
Will the loopsy one return true? The double equals.
I don't know. I guess not.
I was just wondering.
I don't know. I never tried that before. So, notice. We have array, right? We have array 2. At some point, we decided that these should point to the same reference. These should point to the same place in memory. Therefore, we're treating them as the same array or the same object. So if I were to push something into array, everyone familiar with dot push? So it's like the shovel in Ruby, basically. So I'm pushing this into array. So now array is mutated because dot push mutates the thing. Now it has a 5 in it. Should this have a 5 in it too? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? I know you say no. I've made this mistake multiple times. It has a 5 in it. Like I've had times where I make a function and I know it takes an array and I'm trying to be clever. I'm like, I don't want to mutate the original array. So then I make a copy. And I'm like, copy equals array. I can work with copy and then I won't touch the actual array. And then you can't do that. So be very careful when you're trying to make like a copy of an array. Does anyone know how you would make a copy of an array since you can't just assign one thing to the other because it'll affect both of them? I know for a fact there was a lab about this.
Can you
Sarah?
do non-destructive non-destructive functions and methods?
You can use a non-destructive method to do it. Does anyone know a good one?
Could you use the spread operator?
I think you can. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. The thing that, yes, Andy?
I'm just wondering, could you use array now from like how you did before?
You can do that too. You can use spread operator, you can use array from. We'll touch more on that stuff tomorrow. This is getting way too deep. Yes?
I don't think you can use the spread operator in ES5.
You can't. It's an ES6 thing. All right. The one that the labs touched on for sure is slice. So if I do copy equals r.slice, basically the way you use slice is you're able to take a slice of an array. So slice can take different arguments, like you can pass it from what index to what index do I want to take a slice, and it doesn't mutate your original array. It makes like a new copy with what you want in it. And if you don't pass it any arguments, it thinks you just want the whole thing. So copy is this, r is still this, because that's what we copied. But we made it a new thing by using .slice. So if I push something into copy, copy now has that thing. Will R have that thing? It does not. So keep this in mind as you're working with JavaScript. It's exactly the same thing for objects. So like if I have obj1 equal to James, me, and then I have obj2 also equal to James, me, and then I set them equal to each other. And I try to add a new property. So how would I add a new property to object 1? Bracket? Then what? Okay, I'll put food. I like food, you know. I'm a big foodie. So I'll put sushi. I like sushi. So now obj1, oops, has that extra thing. Does obj2 have it? Given what we just learned about arrays. Yes? It also has it. Okay. How do we check all the keys in an object? Okay, tell me the syntax, Ruby. An argument to what? To keys? Good. So again, this is like a certain form of inheritance. Like there's this method .keys that lives on the object prototype, and then you pass it an object and you can see the keys. What about the values?
So they're 700.
Yeah?
Okay, just do values.
Cool. How do I check if a property exists inside of an object? So you'll be doing this frequently. You'll have logic where you're like, I have this object. If a value for this property exists, do one thing. If it doesn't, do another thing. How would you check that? How did you do it in Ruby? So I have obj1. I want to check if there's a property called age inside of obj1. It's very similar to the way you would do it in Ruby.
Not include.
Dot property.
You can do it that way. You can't really, I don't think you would want to do it with includes. I think that's more for arrays. So you can do dot notation to check a certain property. It's going to say undefined. Or you can literally do it the Ruby way, like that. So what's the difference between this this, and this. Ruby?
So the first is dot notation, so you can only use that if it's like one word and it's the literal
Mm-hmm.
key, and then the second one is also with just the literal string that you're passing as a key. So since this is like age, the third one would be like passing in the variable that has age.
Very good. Yeah. So these first two ways is how you can either set a property or check a property on an object. They're very similar. The only difference is you can't use dot notation if you have some kind of special characters in that key. You would have to use the bracket notation with the quotes. And this is when this is not a literal property on the object. Say, for example, you're iterating over an object and you want to see every one of its keys. So you use like an abstract way of viewing all of them. So for example, I really like REPL. I don't know if you've ever used REPL IT. Say we have an object. It's a person object, and it has some properties in it. Who should our person be? I need a volunteer. Andy. Picking on Andy today. Age. I'm not gonna ask you your age because people get weird about that. I'm just gonna put mystery. I don't think I know how to spell. Anyways, it's not worth fixing. What food do you like? I'm in a food kind of mood today.
I mean, I like
Ramen. So we could do stuff like iterate over this object and print out all of the things in it, all of the keys. So you can do something like let key in the object that you're looping over. And then we can console log each thing. And notice, here key does not have like the quotes around it because it's representing all of these things at the same time. Do you guys want a little break?
No, that's plow through it.
Really? Okay, let's plow through it then. That's enough.
All right, we got 30 minutes. Let's have an early lunch.
No, there's more stuff to cover. I mean, 2 minutes? Do you want a 2-minute break?
Yeah, like go to the bathroom, get water, kind of break, and do that.
Sure.
2 minutes.
You're the elder.
Be back by noon. Then we'll plow through the rest.
show you guys my favorite thing.
Is everyone here? Yep.
I only have 5 things for policy, and this one. But I have what's on there.
Ruby's not welcome around JavaScript policy anymore.
We do only have 5 things. Oh, empty string.
Okay.
Did an empty array count?
No, an empty array is truthy in JavaScript.
Right.
I know that, so I figured, that's why I asked you.
Where is everyone? Are we missing anyone?
Cat.
Yeah, just cat.
This is where I start yelling at people in Chinese. Because I've lived in China and now I start saying things like 快点
Can you
Wait.
speak Chinese? Oh.
Yeah, 对对对，你也会说中文吗？
可以。
哦，真的吗？非常好。Now I have some support. Guys, I forgot to show you my favorite thing.
Oh,
What does this get coerced into? Kevin showed me this. He has a lot of tricks up his sleeve. Someone can write a blog post about this. You can like go through some of this and like let's figure out what this thing does. Like, you know. So just through coercion you could do stuff like that. All right, we're going to talk about hoisting. My favorite, hoisting. Hoisting. Yes. All right. So, I promised you we won't do more DOM stuff. This is a little bit DOM-y, but not too much. So, I have this function here, right? There's really nothing that prevents me from writing this function on the outside. Like this. Maybe we can give it a name. Notice. This right here is not being invoked. You cannot do this in Ruby. And this used to trip me up about Ruby for a long time. I'm like, why are there these like naked variables that aren't being invoked? And I would still use my parentheses when using Ruby to try to invoke things and it would work. But like in Ruby, if you write the name of a function, it automatically gets invoked. Like there's no way to stop it from being invoked. But here, this is called a callback. And it only gets invoked when this thing occurs. Right? Did you guys learn about callbacks? Okay. So this is the same syntax as like defining the function right in here. But let's see what happens. It says hello world. How come this function is defined down here and I'm using it before I've defined it and it still works? Why does this work? Like theoretically it shouldn't work. Hugo.
Because did you say it loads the whole page first and then the function?
That's a very good guess, but it's not really to do with that. Ruby. Now you're just throwing around useful keywords because you know that's the answer. Sure.
No, because it makes the first pass and it, and like you can't really go farther than that.
All right. Kat?
Because JavaScript, it goes through like 2 stages. One where it goes through the file and like stores any declarations in memory, and then second where it like does everything.
Yes. Very much so. So when your program, it doesn't like run every line right away. Your program looks through everything first. It does multiple passes. On the first pass, every time it encounters a function, it's like, I know this word named function, and it hoists it to the top. A really, really good blog post again. So it hoists it to the top, and then on the second pass, it actually runs each line so that when it gets to this, it knows from its first pass. It knows that this onload thing, it knows what it is. There is a way to write this function where this won't work. Does anyone know how? Kat.
As a like variable,
Mm-hmm.
would that be it? If you did like const onload equals function.
Yes. So that's a different way that you can declare a function in JavaScript. And again, with like the multiple passes, another thing that happens on the first pass, other than taking functions and hoisting them to the top, every time JavaScript encounters a word like const, var, or let, it declares that variable. So it's as if it does this. You can do this in JavaScript. This just sets your variable to undefined, assuming that you'll change it later. So as it goes through and encounters these variables, it knows what these variables are, but it doesn't know what they're assigned to. So they're all undefined. So it's as if this is happening. And then when it runs line by line, then it finally gets assigned and it knows what it is. So in this case, it doesn't work. Why do we like using const and let and stay away from var? Because I know the labs were telling you, use const and let.
var has scope issues, I think.
That is one of the things that we can go over. There's another reason.
Isn't it like other people can like go into your code and change var and like mess everything up?
It's possible because of the scope issues. But another problem with var is that it throws silent errors. Oh yeah, this is the error I was looking for. Unload is not defined. So right now, my program is yelling at me. It's like, hey, you didn't define unload because this runs before it's defined. If I were to use var, it doesn't work, and it also doesn't tell me what's wrong. So it throws silent errors, which is why we tell you to use const and let. Unless you really know what you're doing with var, then you can use var. So var is more like be familiar with it when you encounter it in people's code, but it's better to use const and let. And my rule of thumb is, well, let me ask you guys, when do you use const and when do you use let? Gavin?
Const when you want something to remain the same throughout.
Mm-hmm. And let? Yeah, when you know you're going to reassign it later. So my rule of thumb is always use const unless you encounter later that like, oh, I have to reassign this thing, because const is more powerful. Okay, let's see what else is on this agenda. All right, a little bit about scope. I have a variable. I set it equal to apples. I'm going to write a function. It's going to be called see my apples. And it's going to console log apples. This is going to work without any issue. See, this is really cool. It like knows where this is coming from. So I invoke this. And it prints out apples, which is a string. In Ruby, you can't do this. Why can't you do this in Ruby? Andy?
Because it's like a scope issue, and it doesn't know what apples is.
Yes. So in Ruby, things are kind of trapped in their local scope. You can't put a variable in your global scope and pull it in. But in JavaScript, you can. Scope, yes? Question? No? Okay.
But in Ruby, can't you if you call it a constant? Like
Yes,
constant,
I believe so. Yes. So, what if we had an apples here inside this scope? And we set it equal to bananas. What would this console log? Why? Can you speak up?
Because you set it to that string in the scope of the function?
Yes. So, scope is kind of like Russian nesting dolls. Have you seen those? Matryoshki. I'm Russian, so I know this thing.
Oh, yeah.
Matryoshki. So, whatever is in your innermost scope, it's going to look what's in its innermost scope, and if it doesn't find it, then it's going to go up a scope and check there. So if it didn't find apples here, like if I named it something else, then it would print the apples that it does find in the parent scope. Another cool thing you can do in JavaScript, which we'll touch on briefly, but we're not going to go into detail today, is functions can return functions. And say I define an apples in here, and I want to console log my apples. What is this going to console log? Mackenzie, what do you think? Well, think of it Russian nesting dolls. This matryoshka is going to look inside of her scope, and she'll find an apples here. So she'll console log that. So, what is this going to show me? Huh? No. Yes. It's going to show me. Wait, did I not save it?
You need to refresh the page.
I need to refresh. It's going to show me a function. The way you think about invoking a function is it's going to show you what it returns. So in this case, we're returning a function. So that's why invoking this thing, it prints out what it returns. If we want to invoke the inner thing, how do we do that? Let's think about it logically. This is a function and it can be invoked. So how do we invoke it if this is a function? Yes, it would exactly work like that. JavaScript is very logical, except when it does weird string coercion. So it prints out oranges. We're not returning anything from that function, so it returns undefined. So that's how scope works in JavaScript, and we'll go more into examples like this tomorrow with functions returning functions. And then let's touch a little bit about block scope versus function scope. Another thing about var versus let. I will start with an example. We're going to do a silly example. If 1 equals 1, which is always going to be true. This is a package. PSA announcement. This is a package called, or it's not a package, it's a font called Lyra Code, where it does cool stuff, like turns arrows into arrows, and it does things like not equals. And if you look up Lyra Code, or actually I think it's called Fira Code, you can get this in Atom, and it's really cool, and it makes things look pretty. So triple equals, let I equal 0, right? We're doing this right here. If I want to console log I, what's going to happen? What am I going to see? Let's find out. Why? Danny?
It's because that I is within the function and you're trying to access it outside of the function.
This is not a function though.
Oh, well, it's because it's inside. I don't know.
So,
Yeah.
yes, this is another subtle difference between var, let, and const. So in the new ES6 syntax, let and const are block scoped. So blocks are things that are inside curlies. So inside if statements, or maybe for loops, if you put something with let in a block, you cannot access it outside of a block. Same thing with const. Like if I were to use the word const here, I would have the same error. But with var, this is no problem. So it's a subtle difference to keep in mind. Does anyone know about for loops in JavaScript and how we would structure one? Gavin?
For
Good point. Good point. I forgot about that.
there, 5 equals 0,
Yeah, so let's go like I less than 5, then what?
5 plus.
We'll take that out. Can we console log I in this situation? We get 5. It went through our loop. I is now 5. What if we use let? Steven says yes. We can console log I. Who says no? Hugo doesn't know, but he's willing to bank on no. Cat? Cat doesn't know. It's literally the same thing as the if. This is another block scope type of thing. I, using let declaration, is stuck inside of this block and you cannot access it from outside. So it's something to keep in mind as you work with JavaScript. But usually you're gonna want to keep your variables that you declare in a block contained in that block. So we recommend using let and const, unless you know what you're doing with var. All right. And then finally we have functions. So tomorrow we're gonna go a lot more deeply into functions. But today we'll do a little bit of intro. We already talked about how functions are special because you can pass them as parameters into other functions. You can return functions from functions, like we did here. Functions are actually objects in JavaScript, and they have their own property. So I'm going to make a function. I'm going to name it, well, I'm going to declare it like this. I'm going to name it Hugo. It's a function. And it's going to console log, I love JS. Do you love JS, Hugo?
Sure.
Now what? Alright. So invoking Hugo, console logs, I love JavaScript. Functions have properties, like for instance, all of these things. Look, it's autocorrecting. What do you think this one does? Oh, it's giving you the answer, damn it. What do you think this one? It gives you the name of the function. What about .length, which I briefly mentioned earlier, if you were paying attention? Yeah, so you can do stuff like this. What if I had an anonymous function? So I'm not naming this function, and I console log hello. What would its name be? I can technically wrap this in parentheses as an entire unit, and then I can call things on it. So .name, look, it's giving me an empty string because it has no name. .length is going to give me 0. What if I had this, and I was returning a sum? What would its arguments be? What would its .length be? I don't know. I don't know what happened there. Oh, you know what? It's this thing. I know what's wrong with it. This is another thing we'll get into. You can do it like this.
There's an extra
Ayo, no more yields. We're done with Ruby. All right, so it does that. Another thing you can do with functions in JavaScript, which we'll touch on more later, is something called an iffy. Does anyone know what that is? Oh, my computer.
Didn't we just do it?
We have not just done it.
Oh, we did.
Do you know what it is?
When you call it right when you declare it. Just
Yeah. So I think of this kind of like an opposite of a callback. With a callback, you can pass a function without invoking it, and it'll get invoked later at some point. Iffy stands for immediately invoked function. So right as you declare a function, you can wrap that function that you've declared in parentheses, and then put an open closing parenthesis right after it, like you're invoking it. Which is kind of interesting. Like, look. I can wrap this whole thing in parentheses, and then I can invoke it.
There's an extra parenthesis.
Now what?
Another extra parenthesis.
Oh no. Why? So there you go. And that's something you can like basically never do in Ruby. It just won't work. All right. we've covered most things. I have heard a request to go over like map and filter, so we can go over those very briefly. Because the syntax looks pretty different from Ruby. So, say I had an array, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How do I use a dot map to transform every element in this array to be 2 greater than it currently is? Gavin?
Dot map.
Great. And what does dot map take?
It takes a callback function.
Great. So how would I structure that?
Function.
Great. What does that function take as a parameter?
It takes the instance, and then an index.
Cat?
It takes like a local variable that corresponds to the element in the array.
Yes. So it takes a variable, and whatever this variable is, it's going to represent each thing in this array one at a time as it's mapping through. What goes in the block?
X plus 2.
This is going to be fun, guys. This is going to be fun.
Return.
Why? Do we need a return?
Yeah.
Why do we need a return?
No.
You need a return because, well, JavaScript functions tend to need returns. And whatever you return here is going to be what you're returning for that new element to be. So, can I do this? Can I console log the whole entire thing? Did it work? It's very good practice to label your arguments in JavaScript. I remind people all the time, people don't do it enough, because in JavaScript you write a lot of console logs in your code to figure out what stuff is. So when you use a console log, public service announcement, it's good practice to label what you're trying to console log, because you're going to be console logging multiple things. So this is the result of mapping, right? Console log can take multiple arguments separated by commas. Yes? Okay. So this works, right? Does anyone know a shorter way to write this? How would you write this with an arrow function? Gavin?
Instead of writing function, you would just have X and then arrow, and then take out the return.
You can do that. So, with arrow functions, when you have one argument, you actually don't even need parentheses. It's only when you have no arguments or more than one argument. So you can do this. This still works. When you have only like a one-line function, you can actually get rid of the return, and you can get rid of the curly braces. And this will work. I think this is like JavaScript trying to be more hip and trying to look more like Ruby, because people coming from Ruby are like, JavaScript, I don't know about this. And I say, toughen up. So this still works. How would we do a filter? What if we did the same thing with a filter, and we want to return all elements that are greater than 2? I want Mackenzie to do this one. You requested we go over this. It's similar to Ruby, kind of. So what does .filter or .map take as an argument? It takes a function. So it takes a function, right? And in that function, you tell it what to do, what to check for. So like, for instance, in Ruby, we did we did dot select, and then we gave it a block. And then the thing between the pipes represented each thing. And then after the pipes, we said the condition that we wanted. It's pretty similar in JavaScript. It takes a function, and the thing in the curlies, or in the parentheses for that function, is each element. And the thing it returns is what we're looking for. So like x greater than 2. It's not too different. Oh no, now what? Let's see if this worked. There we go. So it got us what we want. And what's the shortcut way to do it in one line? Danny, do you know?
Which one, what are we trying to do in one line?
Trying to do a dot filter with a one line.
Well, you could turn it into an arrow function. By
like
yeah,
this?
you put arrow there, and then you can get rid of those braces.
Which ones? These ones?
Early ones, yeah. Just make see that one up above it. Just make it look like
Very nice.
you know.
Cool. So that's something you can do here. All right. That's about everything I have to cover for today. I do want to touch on debugging because you're going to be doing a lot of JavaScript labs. One thing I recommend is debugging things that you work on. You can console log. Is anyone familiar with using the debugger tool though?
What do you mean the debugger?
There's a debugger tool. So,
Touched on.
yes. So this is an example JavaScript lab that you guys were exposed to. If I run learn, it opens up the testing environment, which is in the browser. If I go in here, I can see stuff. But say I open this lab. Things are broken. I don't know why. I've thrown a debugger into one of these functions. So now my code can stop here, and it's kind of like binding.pry. So let's try that one more time. So I open my Chrome console, I refresh, and now I'm trapped in debugger. And it tells me where I am. And if you use this thing, let me make this bigger. This thing steps through your function one line at a time. And you can go through and see what things are. You can hover over variables, and it tells you what they are. So it's kind of like binding.pry. You can go in your console and you can type out variables that you have access to and run different lines of code. So I encourage you to get comfortable using debugger. All right, that's all I have. Enjoy your lunch. Any questions? Any concerns? Any fears? Any excitements?
I have a question.
Yes, Sarah.
I think I missed pass by reference versus pass by value. Did you just like in one sentence?
Oh gosh.
Like maybe I was watching the whole time, but I just missed the connection.
It's not a one sentence thing,
Right.
but basically with like pass by reference is you're pointing to the reference where something is stored. So if you set an object equal to, like as a variable, you set an object equal to another object as a variable, they're going to point to the same reference.
That's pass by reference.
Yes, and every time you manipulate one of them and mutate it, it's going to mutate the other.
Right. Okay. And then pass by value.
Pass by value is just for primitives, so that like doesn't happen with primitives, and you can't even mutate primitives. It means like the value is actually stored, not the reference in memory.
So reference is like a function.
It's like how you point to a certain thing. So when something is passed by reference, it points to where that thing is stored in memory. But pass by value is like that variable is stored as that variable.
Okay.
I don't know if that's a good explanation.
Okay.
We can go over it more later. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. I hope it's helpful. I wish I had a lecture like this when I was getting started.
Hey,
Hey.
can I ask you a question?
Yes. I gotta figure out how to